Hey, everybody. Good to see you all. Glad to be here. We are hopping into this discussion today because it's tax week, right? We had April 15th. Tax deadline has come and gone. But this discussion around whether your church is spending money that it could probably allocate to other areas in paying for taxes, right? Oh, this has been a discussion that I've had with lots of churches over the years, and I'm happy to hop into it with you all. So, first of all, let me just start with this reality. I want to give you a couple of real life scenarios. I was grateful to be able to hear from a church that, over these years, I've worked with churches and denominations for over 20 years. So sometimes I've done work and I didn't necessarily remember the particulars, but this person came back to say thank you. And it was a church that was paying property taxes, and they had been paying it over many years and did not have the insights as to how to take care of this issue. And they told me that it was tens of thousands of dollars that the church had been spending over the course of years. There's also a church that I'm working with right now that has been around for a number of years. They never had their letter of determination from the IRS. I'm going to jump into that, what that means. And so they also never had their exemption from sales and use tax. So every time they were going to buy products and things for their ministry, things for their church, they were also paying taxes, right? So there are these ways where money that the church needs for its operations, to make sure that it's operating well, gets utilized. It's kind of being, I can't think of a better word than wasted in paying taxes. So there are tax dollars that churches are losing because of these unknown things that we're going to talk about today. So I want to help you. If you're a part of church leadership, if you are a donor at a church, make sure that you're sharing this. Make sure that your church knows about this. Share this video with other church leaders that you serve with so that really we can make sure that our churches have the information and insights that they need. And say hi in the comments. Let me know where you're joining from. I always like to be able to welcome you. So thanks for being here. Okay, so let me just go in and say, I want to, first of all, dismantle this understanding of why many churches assume that they don't have to pay taxes, right? So let me start with that. There's a big gap between what many churches assume about taxes and what the law actually requires, right? So if you haven't met me, I'm Eureka Cole. I'm the church attorney for over 20 years. My whole practice has focused on serving denominations and churches and helping them structure their operations in a way that protects them and their leaders. So this is exactly what I do. It's my jam. The confusion, though, really comes between when churches are mixing up maybe this federal income tax exemption with being tax-free across the board. That's not how it works. So let's separate these things so that we're all clear. Why many churches assume they don't have to pay taxes? Well, churches assume we're automatically tax exempt. That is true, but also misunderstood. So let me unravel that a bit. I literally wrote this guide. It's called the Church Attorney's Guide. And I'll have my team drop that link as well, on 501c3 tax exempt status. The subtitle is How to Obtain, Maintain, and Protect Your Church's Tax Exempt Status. So a lot of what I'm going to share, there's more here because I obviously can't do it all in this live. There is a truth that churches are presumed to be tax exempt. So you've heard that term. They are presumed to be tax exempt, but that's not the same as being able to demonstrate that you have gone through the process of applying for tax exempt status and receiving that letter of exemption. That's really a key difference. So churches are presumed to not have to pay federal income tax on mission related income, right? But that's very different from how people sometimes stretch it incorrectly to mean that there's no tax obligation ever at all in any way, right? Those two things are not the same. Now, also, there is the reality that churches are the only type of tax exempt organization that's not automatically required to file a Form 990, right? And that is, if you know, the IRS does everything by form, right? W-2, a I-9, a 1023, right? So the 990 is that information return about all of the financials of the organization. So churches generally are not required to file a Form 990. So that sometimes gives the impression that they don't have any obligations at all. And that, of course, is not the same thing. So there's also a certain mindset I found in church that, we're doing ministry, there's, not business. And I agree. The Lord says, Jesus said, upon this rock, I will build my church, right? He's building a church, not a business. And from a temporal standpoint, while we are on this earth, there are business requirements associated with church operations. So it's important to know that while it is for God, the IRS does distinguish religious or charitable, usually exempt activities from other kinds of commercial activities, employment, etc. So we'll get more into that as well. Sometimes churches just get bad advice, right? There are professionals, most professionals don't, most attorneys and most professionals aren't working with churches in this close way. So I was raised in the church. I always share the story that my mom was my Sunday school teacher. My dad was the deacon and trustee at our church. We were at church all the time. And I thank God for that. So I was raised in the church. I am still involved in church. Thank God now that my kids have gotten to the age that they serve in church, and my husband and I. So it's just a beautiful part of our lives, and it's very real. So I understand that that church is a place where we come together, the fellowship, ultimately to uplift Jesus, right, as Lord, and also to serve our community. But sometimes there's this bad advice that can trickle around, right? So sometimes a leader will just copy what the previous leadership did, right? Or they'll rely on information from other pastors, and sometimes it's just not accurate, right? So sometimes there's just not accurate information, and that's one of the many reasons why I love the work that I get to do. I love Faithful Foundation's membership, which you'll hear more about. I love being a part of really having I believe, God-given vision to create. Thanks for the Heart, to create the membership so that churches can have a reliable place to get legal insights that are needed. Sometimes there's also just confusion on different types of taxes. And so I'm going to be breaking that down for you as well. So let's start with maybe the area of tax that churches are most familiar with. Churches are generally most familiar with federal income tax, right? Income tax. You hear people say that that the only things that are certain are death and income taxes. And certainly income taxes are real because, again, just this week, April 15th, hopefully everybody got their filings done. We all, as a nation, if you have any income, you're required to file your taxes. Also, as a business, I have to file my business tax return earlier and by March 15th. But nevertheless, as a part of operations, you're regularly filing taxes and paying taxes, right? So churches are presumed to be exempt from that federal income tax. So while they bring in, by God's grace, tithes, offerings, gifts from donors, they don't have a tax liability on that. But there are other kinds of taxes that churches need to be aware of. And as I mentioned, hi, Olivia, I see your question. I'm going to get to that. Any other questions, if you guys want to drop it, I'll try to get to those before I wrap up. So federal income taxes for sure. But here's the reality. If the church does not apply for tax exempt status, then and receive that letter of determination from the IRS, and you hear me use that phrase, letter of determination, that is the document that if and when approved, I'm grateful that I have a 100% success rate in applying for tax exempt status. When approved, then the IRS will send you a letter that says, yes, we reviewed your application and all the supplementals, and we find that you meet the Section 501c3 requirements for tax exempt status. Here's your letter. Hold on to it forever, right? So a lot of other taxes you cannot be exempt from without that letter. So let me give you a couple of examples. The first is state and local property taxes. You heard me give that example earlier on of a church that I was able to assist. They were paying tens of thousands of dollars over the years on their property tax. A lot of churches assume that just because the church owns the property, then the church automatically does not have to pay property taxes. And that's just not true. Generally speaking, in most jurisdictions, when you own the property as a church, you then have to apply for approval of property exemption. So it's not automatic in most places. It generally requires an application. And if the property is used for any purpose that's a non-exempt purpose, then it still may not be tax exempt. And if, for example, it's leased, many states will say if you lease the property to four property entities, then it's also not going to be considered exempt, even if it's owned by the church. So there are processes there. This is an area where many churches are leaking thousands of dollars because they're not aware of this property tax, the need to apply for property tax exemption. Sometimes by the time churches become aware of it, they already have thousands of dollars in arrears or thousands of dollars that they're required to pay. I've even seen situations, unfortunately, where the church property has gone up for tax sale because churches were not aware. So I want to sound the alarm. Don't assume that you're automatically exempt. You should probably assume the opposite and make sure you do your due diligence. Another key area is sales and use tax. This varies, again, heavily by state. But this is an area where churches are like if you go to Staples, for example, and you've got to buy a shredder for the church, you've got to buy a printer, or you've got to buy paper or whatever it is. Obviously, the state will have sales and use tax. Well, if you are a church, often you can apply for that exemption. But again, this generally doesn't happen automatically. So often churches may have to pay sales tax on those purchases, collect sales tax on certain areas. And also, again, you assume that the exemption automatically applies to all transactions, but it definitely doesn't. So you only are going to have it if you apply for it and are able to receive this exemption. Another thing I want to point out is sometimes churches are operating in a way, and this isn't a bad thing, but there may be some operations that are unrelated to its ministry purposes. For example, I have churches that I've worked with that have solar leases. That obviously doesn't have anything to do with church operations, right? The mission of the church, the purpose of the church. I worked with churches, for example, they just happen to be in a perfect position to have a billboard on top of their church. And again, that's a lease where the church gets money. And when the church gets money in this way, the IRS will consider this unrelated business income. So because it's unrelated from your purpose as a church. That is generally a taxable event. And that's okay. The churches that I work with, they say, well, we're getting this amount of money, right? And so we're willing to pay this smaller percentage in taxes. But again, you have to be aware of this tax policy, right? And so that's really what we want to be able to highlight. So as you can imagine, this area around church operations, certainly when it comes to tax exempt matters, can be significant, and it can be tough to sort of thread the needle to know where the requirements are. But that's why I'm grateful to be able to serve churches in this way. And I want to invite you to be a part of a cohort of pastors, church leaders that are coming together online in Faithful Foundation's membership. I created this membership because I wanted it to be a place where we could walk through topics just like this on a regular basis to help you understand not only what applies to your church, but what steps you should take to remain compliant, to remain protected, and to make sure that you're not leaking resources, because churches want to make sure you want to make sure that you manage those donations and honor God with it. So our spring cohort is now open, but it's only open through the end of this month. So you only have another week or so to get in the doors, and we really want you to be there. So if you've been looking for ongoing guidance, clear direction, a trusted place to get support for your church's legal and compliance needs, this is an opportunity to take the next step. So click the link that's in the comments. I would love to see you there. I am personally there with our monthly Q&As, so you'll be able to come and bring your questions, like the question that Olivia is asking, and I'm taking that question now. She says, as a ministry cost, what are considerations for generating profit without creating tax liability or interrupting nonprofit status, i.e. renting out our space? Yeah, Olivia. So yeah, you probably heard me touch on that a little bit. Generally speaking, unless you're doing something very much out of bounds, the issue isn't likely so much losing tax exempt status. Again, I have spoken on that, the ways, and hopefully you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I think I have some videos on that about the things that churches can do to lose their tax exempt status. But really what we're talking about is what you said, considerations for generating profit without creating tax liability. I want to reframe that a little bit, because again, this is where we get into the unrelated business income tax that I talked about. If a church earns income from, for example, a regular business activity, or if it's not substantially related to its mission, I've given examples of like merchandise sales that are beyond just incidental, solar leases, billboard leases, other kinds of activities where you are having maybe rental income with services, like that kind of thing. Rental income can be tricky because there are lots of different points around that. Then it may just be a matter of, again, not losing your tax exempt status, but it may be a taxable event. It may be something that the church needs to pay a portion, or would be required to pay a portion of those funds for tax purposes. And I also want to say, sometimes churches can get creative. You know, they'll say, well, we're taking a donation of this amount in exchange for this. But if it's in exchange for something, that can be tricky as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at some of the other videos that I have on YouTube about this. So thanks so much for your question, Olivia. And thank you all for being here today. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of the day. I hope that you will join me and other church leaders in Faithful Foundation's membership. It is a fantastic community, and we'd love to have you there. All right. Blessings. Thanks so much. Bye.